That's very helpful if you're trying to work your way through and put everything in order and look at everything that happens from Genesis to Malachi. And so we're going to talk a lot tonight about a boring topic called genealogies, but it's very important because it's amazing how much information the Bible has in it that's been proven to be historically accurate. A lot of people will be like, oh, there's no proof these people lived here, but now there is. Archaeology has been tremendous in recent years to confirm all these different accounts from the Bible and tell us that there were these different groups of people living in these different parts of the world. So I've got a map for you in that section, and we'll talk about that map in just a moment. First of all, the things you don't need. Well, let me do announcements first. Don't forget, we are starting up our seniors breakfast again on the 26th of the month, 9 a.m. in the morning. So don't forget, seniors breakfast is coming up. Isn't the weather a lot better than it was a few weeks ago? So, it's so much better. Even with the fog this morning, it's like, man, it's still nicer. Even though I can only see like 50 feet in front of my car, it was still so much nicer than last few weeks. So hopefully this is going to hold up. It looks like in the long-range forecast, we're going to see some pretty warm temperatures for this time of the year. So it looks like we're good for seniors breakfast and everything else over the next couple of weeks. Also, don't forget that if you want to come and walk, it is still a little unpleasant out there for walking most days. On Mondays from 10 to 12, Wednesday from 12 to 2, and Friday from 10 to 12. Those doors are open. Just ring in at the office and we'll let you in, and you can come on in, go over to the gym. The lights will be on, the heat will be on, and you can walk, get a little exercise. So still got people doing that again this year. So just wanted to let everybody know you're welcome, invite you to come and walk and get a little exercise. And then when the weather gets a little warmer, you can until people quit coming, we keep opening it. Once people quit coming, let's let you walk outside. So, but as long as you want to use it, as long as people keep coming, it'll be open those days, and we'll let you come in and walk. Papers. All right, so let's eliminate the ones you're not going to use tonight to avoid confusion. The big pretty one with all the colors on it, that's for a couple weeks. So that's the family of Abraham. Lay that off to the side. So I would like you to take a look at it this week on your own. That way you're kind of familiar with it before we start to cover it. The second one, the stapled package that says Old Testament chronology. We're going to use this a lot, but not tonight, okay? So you can lay that aside as well. The Old Testament chronology, just lay that off to the side also. The ones we're going to use tonight, we're going to read through Noah's family real quick because I want to explain something to you that this is the best explanation I could find. And I'm going to explain a couple things to you, and then we're going to dive into Genesis chapter 10. And in your stacks out there, you also picked up one that says the nations of Genesis. Everybody have this little map on it? I'm going to show you where everybody comes from. How's that for a good deal tonight? So biblically, we're going to go through, and we're going to identify, and I'm going to explain to you why there's war in the Middle East. Because the feud is a long-standing feud. We're going to show all this because biblically we can identify every one of these nations from the descendants of Noah. And we're going to do that in Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, by the way, is often referred to as the Table of Nations because it covers the time not just after the flood but after Babel as well. And it traces in the Bible these groups and where they came from. So the tribes began to form around influential patriarchs. Some of them were the direct children of Noah's children. Some of them were grandchildren of Noah's children. But these groups then became solidified in the world. And once you understand what the Bible says about the nations and that table of nations, we're going to follow the Old Testament chronology through the Bible and through outside historical sources as well. So we'll be looking at the secular kings who are often mentioned in the Bible also, but are then recorded in other historical accounts such as stone tablets and things of that nature that have been discovered through the years. And we'll track it along with the biblical chronologies and the biblical characters and who they were born to, where they lived, what they did. And that's how we'll kind of survey our way through. Last week 2 weeks ago, we covered Genesis, the creation, fall, flood. But then we're going to focus on history from that forward. So when we survey, that's what most of the Old Testament is about. It's really mostly about Abraham on. So we want to set the stage tonight with the breakdown of who lived where. And that will show a lot of that animosity that actually existed even back then, where there was a lot of strife and a lot of conflict amongst these various nations. So let's get started tonight with the Noah's family handout first. So you'll see at the top, there's a little bit of a chart there as well. And it shows Noah and his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then their children. So you see that next line underneath, that's just the children of each son. Doesn't track daughters. Okay, so it doesn't. The Bible doesn't. It usually tracks through the male. And so Shem has his 5 sons listed: Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And then Ham has 4 sons listed: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Japheth, underneath his name, there are, let's count them out, 1, 2, 3, 4. He has 7: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. So they have all these children. That's a lot of sons. They have a lot of sons. And what we're going to find is that the nations come from these sons and then some of their children. And we're going to be able to track that entire region of the world that was settled after the flood and after Babel in just a moment. So we're going to try to find all the descendants for each national and or regional group. And chapter 10, again, is often referred to as the Table of Nations. Now, something to keep in mind as we work our way through, the Table of Nations is a horizontal genealogy rather than a vertical one. So those in chapters 5 and 11 are vertical, but chapter 10 is horizontal. So basically what it does is it tracks each brother, one brother at a time. It doesn't just go vertically, it tracks them horizontally. So it's a little confusing, but the chart at the top is kind of the way in which it functions. So it's kind of structured in that fashion. It's going to seem like a vertical when we're reading each son's descendants, but they call it a horizontal genealogy because it jumps back to the sons of Noah, and then it starts again, and then it jumps back, and it starts down again. That's all it means. So tribes shown to be kin would be in league together. We see this. But let me just read this whole thing because it's worth reading. The Table of Nations is a horizontal genealogy rather than a vertical one. Those in chapters 5 and 11 are vertical. Its purpose is not primarily to trace ancestry. Instead, it shows political, geographical, and ethnic affiliations among tribes for various reasons, most notable being holy war. Tribes shown to be kin would be in league together. Thus, this table aligns the predominant tribes in and around the land promised to Israel. These names include founders of tribes, clans, cities, and territories. The table shows which people in the ancient world shared in the blessing and cursing motif. The table also stresses how they spread out and replenished the earth, though not in obedience. They all came from one, Noah, and were therefore one people. But some were closely related and others were distant. The table also shows the plight of the human race, scattered across the face of the earth and living according to their own cultural and linguistic affiliations. Wars and conflicts inevitably result from this arrangement. Now, look at your map. We're going to identify all of these from the Genesis 10 narrative, and then we're going to make some points as we work through, because Genesis does have the genealogies, but it also has some very important information for us in there as well. And we're going to place everyone on the map. Something you'll notice on the map before we even start is that each box represents a person, and then a tribe was formed through that person. Notice how scattered out they are. That's a pretty big region. So if you look closely, the map has Turkey at the top left corner. So as you're looking at your map, top left corner is Turkey, modern day Turkey. To the right and down a little bit is modern day Syria. To the top right is modern day Soviet Union, Russia. And then we have underneath that Iran. On the other side of the rivers, we have Iraq. And then we have Saudi Arabia at the very bottom. The Jordan area just above that, Israel to the left, and then Egypt to the left at the very bottom. So we're covering an area from Egypt across to the other boundary of Iraq, all the way up to Russia, and all the way across to Turkey. That's a big geographical area. And these, at this point, are not huge people groups when they're scattered. They're substantial, but they're not huge yet. And so these people are scattered over a very, very large regional area. So after Babel, they all have a different language. And in that different language, then, they began to form these ethnic groups, these tribal affiliations. And then eventually, when they started to grow much larger in number, they began to encroach on each other's territories. So if you're going to survey the Old Testament, you kind of have to understand this. You have to know who's who, and you have to know where they live. And then the conflicts make a lot more sense. And you also begin to see where Abraham comes from. You begin to get an understanding of the direction that he traveled and why he ran into conflicts when he traveled there because of these, again, tribal affiliations that had become really hardened by the time we get to Abraham. So we're going to point out one other thing on the page, and then we'll get into it. The Hittites, one of the ones we have to identify, don't really have a biblical designation as to who they formed around, who their tribe formed around. Most people believe, most theologians believe, that the Hittites were an offshoot of the Canaanites, that they were part of the tribe that formed around Canaan. And who was Canaan? It was at the very top. He's one of Ham's sons, so we kind of know who he was. He's one of Ham's sons, and a tribe formed around him that was scattered at Babel, and they had their own area and their own distinct language. And it's believed that the Hittites was a fragment group that separated from that tribe and formed a tribe of its own. But we don't have a name in the Bible that would designate that particular tribe. So it's kind of hard to track the Hittites biblically until we get to a certain point. So everybody else, we kind of know their origin because it's here in Genesis 10. The Hittites, not so much. But we do see them later on. Also, our Foxid, if you look at the top under Shem, directly under Shem, it's spelled with an X. In the Old Testament Hebrew, it's spelled differently. It's the same one. So in the Greek New Testament, it's spelled, you see this at the bottom of that first page with the chart at the top, A-R-P-H-A-X-A-D, that's the New Testament English translation of the Greek, and R-P-A-C-H-S-H-A-D is the translation, the English translation of the Hebrew in the Old Testament. Same person. So don't be confused by it, it's not confusing. But this is actually mentioned, this man is actually mentioned in Luke 3:36 as well. So a lot of people have gotten confused by that. I don't want you to be confused by that. So when we get to that point on the map, it's actually spelled with the X, so don't be confused by that on the map either. I copied that. I probably would have spelled it the Hebrew way so it wouldn't be confusing, but it's just spelled with the New Testament designation. And also the fact that when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, they spelled it that way in the Old Testament as well. Everybody clear on that so it's not confusing? Cool. All right, let's move on. I'm going to go real slow because we're going to take our time. I'm going to help you find all these. I'm even going to be willing to walk out there if you want my help because I want you to know who everybody is and where they come from in your Bible. What I like to do, and in my Bible, I did this, and I did this also on a printout for my own benefit. But in my Bible, I went through and I found all these when I did this class, and I circled the name, and then I highlighted it in my Bible so I would know where it was. And then I put a number next to it that matched the number I put on my map. So I could easily go back to Genesis 10 and find all the different people groups from where all these different tribes came from. So if you want to do that tonight, I'll try to go slow enough. I can't promise I will, but I'll try. And that way you can identify all these. And then when we're studying these different people in weeks to come and we're surveying our way through, you'll say, hey, I know where those people lived. I know where they were at. I know who they descended from. And then we'll know all those different things. And it's a big deal as we work our way through and we're able to identify different places and people. So let's start with the first couple of verses. These are the records. So it tells us right up front that Genesis 10 is clearly a historical record of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. All right, so he's talking about the direct sons of Noah. And then he says on top of that, we're talking about and sons were born to them after the flood. So after the flood, we have the three boys, and then they started having children, and it records for us in this particular chapter all of their sons. And then it goes even beyond that and gives us some of their grandchildren. And it starts right out then in verse 2, not wasting any time. It's going to dive into this. It's going to be a lot of people as we go through this. And I'll be honest, a lot of these names are hard to pronounce. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tyrus. Three of these are highlighted in red because three of these men were the galvanizing influence that developed specific tribes. Gomer, Madai, and Javan. So they're going to show up on our map because they became the fathers of individual tribes, individual groups of people. The other brothers did not, but these brothers did. And then when they were scattered, people traveled to a different region under this name. We are of the tribe of Gomer. We are under the tribe of Madai. We are under the tribe of Javan. And so they traveled with that identity. This was their ethnic identity then because of that. So let's find the first one. The first one is Gomer. Look at the top left of your map where it says Turkey. What do you see right above Turkey? Gomer. There's Gomer. So Gomer's easy. We found Gomer right off the bat. It's right above modern-day Turkey. So what's beautiful about this is, as far as we can tell, historically researching this, the descendants of Gomer still live in modern-day Turkey. How cool is that? So the descendants of Gomer, as far as we can tell, and we have quite a bit of information, they still live in Turkey. The other group that shares a part of Turkey, just below them and to the right, which we won't put a number next to them because they're not going to be found in chapter 10, the next group is the Hittites, which you can see if you look south down from the Hittites, you'll see the Canaanites right above Israel. It's easy to see that if there was a fracture in that tribe, the Hittites moved north to get away from, and they found sort of an open area between Gomer and Togmarah, and that's where they settled. So modern-day Turkey is still inhabited by the descendants of Gomer and the descendants of the Hittites, as far as we can tell. The remnants remained there, and then eventually population built back up, and that's where those people come from. The second one on our list is Madai. Now, Madai is a little harder to find, so we got to look a little more. And I got to look because I lost track of where I put it. Madai, M-A-D-A-I. It's below Iran. Yes, it is. Thank you. I was going to be looking for a while. If you guys can find them quicker than me, you shout them out, because I even numbered them in advance. My cheat sheet's not even working. So number 2 is Madai. Magog is the son after Gomer, but Magog doesn't have a tribe affiliated with his name. But have you heard the term Magog before? Where did you hear it? Revelation. Ezekiel too. So we have it in Revelation, we have it in Ezekiel, but we do not have it in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, which I find extremely odd, don't you? But for some reason, Magog, who is a descendant of Japheth, does not have a tribe associated with him. So we don't know where they settled, so we just kind of leave that alone. But Magog then is later mentioned in both Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. In fact, Magog is the nation from the north that descends. Remember, in the book of Revelation, Magog will descend from the north, is what it says. But Madai is what we're looking for. It is just south of Iran. Now, if you look at that little box, and I tried to blow these up, but I just couldn't get it to work, it actually tells us who the tribe of Madai became in ancient times. They became the Medes. You remember the Medes and the Persians formed an alliance and did what? Conquered Babylon. So all these things fit together. As far as we can tell, again, the Medes and the Persians still are the people who live in Iran. So the modern day Iranians, they're descended from Madai. The third one is Javan. That one I know. It's in southern Turkey, just on the coastline. So if you look at Turkey, go all the way to the left and go down. Javan is right below Lud. And those became the Greeks. They're not actually living in Turkey. They actually live in a little island chain that, if you look real closely, is right there. That's Greece. So Javan, his descendants, became the Greeks. So as far as we know, again, pretty much everything we know from history, both biblical and extra-biblical, the Greeks are still the descendants of Javan. So his descendants still live in the Greek Isles. All right, let me find my thingy. Here it is. Let's move on to the next one, verses 3 and 4. We got 3 more here as well. The sons of Gomer. And again, Gomer is who? Now look back at your other chart. It's easy to follow along if you look up here. So everybody look at this chart. Tell me who Gomer is. Gomer is the son of Japheth. So this is not one of Japheth's sons now. Now we're talking about Japheth's grandsons. So the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphtah and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, which is also a son of Japheth, were Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dedanim. Now, what's fascinating about this, again, is there's so much importance in these names. Only 3 became attached to tribes. But have you heard the term Tarshish before? Where was Saul from? Saul of Tarshish. So one of the sons of Javan, who was a son of Japheth, formed the city Tarshish. And that's where the name came from. And it stuck all the way back into this time period. Again, it's amazing. People discount this, but historically it's 100% accurate. Tarshish was the city that this grandson started, just a city, and that's the city that Saul came from then in the New Testament, Tarshish. All right. So let's identify the 3 that did become tribes: Ashkenaz, Togarmah, and Kittim. Let's find Ashkenaz first. Anybody want to take a shot at that one while I'm looking for it? Below the Soviet Union. I'm going to quit using my cheat sheet. You guys are quicker than I am with my cheat sheet. Right below the Soviet Union. So these people became the Scythians. So you'll see this in secular history as the Scythian people. They existed in that region of northern Iran, southern Russia, where they still reside to this day. The people that live there are descendants from these people. If you think about the nations that sit just above Iran and just below Russia, all of them are direct descendants of this people group, and then some of the people in northern Iran and some of the people in southern Russia, as they spread out as a tribe, they inhabited that whole region. And they've never been dislodged from that region. So they've always kind of lived in that general area. The 5th one, what is the 5th one? Lud, right? No, that's not it. It's Togarmah. Togarmah is the 5th one. Anybody know where it is? It's to the left. Right in the middle of the top. Exactly, right in the middle of the top. So it's between the word Turkey and Soviet Union, almost smack dab in the middle. So again, that's mostly in Turkey, partially in Russia. Again, same group of people living in the same part of the world. Number 6 would be Kittim. Anybody see Kittim on there anywhere? Down below, island dwellers, they live in what is known today as modern-day Cyprus. Cyprus. So Kittim is the island just above the word Lebanon, if you're looking for it. It's right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So Kittim became known as the island of Cyprus. The people that live there are descendants of Kittim. In fact, as far as we can tell, none of these people were ever completely dislodged from the land in which they dwelt, except for the Philistines. The Philistines were never completely dislodged, but the Canaanites were by Israel. And we'll look at that later when we get to that point. All right. Everybody with me? Everybody caught up? Cool. No? What'd you miss? Huh? Slow down? Oh, I can slow down. Okay. If you missed anything, let me know. We'll help you find it. You guys are doing great. You're finding them quicker than I am, and I even marked my sheet up in advance, and I'm looking for the numbers I put on there. So there's a lot of nations on there, isn't there? Now, just while we're looking, we can pause and talk about a few things in between as we go. What do you think happened? Knowing how people are and that people have always been basically the same, we're all sinners by nature. What do you think happened as these tribes got bigger and bigger and they began to spread out over larger and larger regional areas? Because they're agricultural, right? They need a lot of land to survive. They don't have food factories. Everything's grown, everything's raised. They started to bump into each other, didn't they? What happens when people start to bump into each other for resources like land, water, grass, things of that nature? Conflict. They fought a lot. They started to really fight. They started to not get along. So what you're going to see then is a lot of this division that exists today actually has roots that are 3,000 plus years old. They even go back before Israel existed, some of these differences, some of these animosities and these feuds. Because Israel was not a nation at this point, right? Israel comes from Abraham, and Abraham comes from the land of Uz. So this predates Abraham. That's why we started here. This predates Abraham. And these nations started having conflicts before Israel was ever placed into the midst of them. But also, Israel is kind of interesting to me because God put them there to be a light, to show people His glory. If you look at this closely, and if we were to enlarge this map to include Egypt and all the regions south of Egypt, Israel's right smack dab in the middle of the civilized world of its day. Where are you going to put the light if you want everybody to see it? Right in the middle. That's where we're going to put it. You're going to put it right in the middle. All right, so let's move on to our next one, verse 5. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands. So it tells us a little bit of information about what happens to these people now. So as they're scattering out, before he gets into the next genealogy, he's explaining to us how they scattered and where they went and how they were identified. He says, so from the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands. So they a lot of times wanted a portion of the coastline because that's where they could fish and do other things to gain resources. And they began to separate out. Everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. So we begin to see what separated people. This really is about politics, if you will, not like we think of politics. It's also about nations and nationhood. So they took care of their own, as they should, and they separated into these various areas, and then the fighting started as they began to bump into each other, seeking more resources as they grew numerically. But notice the division. The division was first of all around language, second of all around family, and third about nations. So the families is what produced the nations. Very tribal in their affiliations, but then they had national boundaries. They knew where they were. They knew what belonged to them. And it was fine until they didn't have enough. Does that sound anything like what happens in the world even to this day? So this is nothing new. It's part of living in a fallen world. So you have this constant competition and pushing and shoving because we got so many people on the planet now. And so they often run into each other in these conflicts around geography and resources. And you have this division of language and tribal affiliations that creates this division. And then the animosity as people jockey back and forth for resources. And that's what happens here. And he's describing that for us. He's telling us how it happened, how the layout took shape. And then as we study the history, we get into the Kings and the Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Samuel and all the other historical narratives, we begin to see how this really plays out and how difficult life became as the world became more populated. Verse 6 and 7, we get some more nations here. The sons of Ham, moving on to a different son, so we've covered Japheth and all the tribes that formed out of his lineage. We move on to Ham, who has 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now, we know for a fact, and the map's going to show where 2 of his sons, 2 tribes came and rose up in affiliation with Put and Canaan. Then it tells us the sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Ramah and Sabteka, and the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. We don't know for certain where the descendants of Cush went. And there's a lot of fables and a lot of stories about it. We won't even worry about those. We'll just identify the ones we know. So Put and Canaan. Put next. Where is Put on here? Bottom left in Egypt. Exactly, they're in Egypt. Bottom left in Egypt. So all the way to the left, towards the bottom of your map, you'll see Put, and they are in Egypt. The next one is Canaan. We should know where Canaan is. Right up there by the word Israel, right? Just above the word Israel. Canaan. And Canaan, those became the Canaanites. They became known as the Canaanites. That was the group of people that God commanded Israel to drive out of the promised land because he was so angry with how they were living and what they were doing with their worship of idols that he wanted them to completely destroy that entire group of people. He wanted that entire nation wiped out because of the depravity of their lives. So they were descendants of Ham. All right. Verse 8 and 9, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. So this is where we do know a little bit more about Cush. He became the father of Nimrod. And we know a lot about Nimrod because he was supposedly the instigator of the construction of the Tower of Babel. It tells us he became a mighty one on the earth, a mighty one. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. It even became a saying that the Hebrew people were familiar with, that if you were a really great hunter, they would say, like Nimrod, you are a mighty hunter before the Lord. So they actually had figures of speech. They had things that they shared and used with effect, and this is one of them. It doesn't mean much to us. In fact, Nimrod means something else to us, doesn't it? I believe if you look it up in the dictionary, Nimrod means you're dumb or something like that. I think is the English definition of the use of the term. But it meant something entirely different to them. It meant mighty hunter or even valiant warrior, depending upon the nation that had a story about him. Now, Nimrod, it tells us the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, notice they're not highlighted and they're not going to show up on our map. And the reason being is we know that out of Cush came Nimrod, and out of Nimrod then became a tribal affiliation that eventually produced Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So we know generally where they are. The problem is, as far as we can tell, they didn't survive as a nation or as a people group. So the map doesn't identify them. And we're not exactly sure where Babel was. There's a lot of different ideas, some of them better supported than others, but there's no definitive answer. So that's not included on the map. Probably the most prevalent one is somewhere in modern-day Syria or Iran. That's probably the most prevalent, possibly Iraq in that big open space where none of the other tribes appear. But that's just guesswork, so we're not going to use it. We're not going to talk about it. We'll look more later on at the Babylonians, which may or may not have been descendants of Nimrod, because, again, we don't have any real solid biblical evidence to connect them. We can assume, but we can't really connect. From that land, he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh. So we do know that he also built the city of Nineveh, which we do know where that's at, and that he, for a time, sojourned in the land that was then eventually the Assyrian Empire. And we also know where that is, and we'll identify that later when it actually appears. And then Rehoboth and Calah and Resen between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. So one thing to take out of this, because we're not going to get a tribal affiliation, but just how many cities did Nimrod have influence in? This dude was a builder, right? I mean, I don't know, he had a lot of other issues, but this guy liked to build things, and when he built one, he finished it and he went on to the next. He spent a lifetime building. So a lot of the ancient cities of antiquity actually were originated by Nimrod. And we have the biblical narrative that gives him credit for these various cities. And we're very familiar with Nineveh, for example, and Babel. We're very familiar with those cities. There's a lot of biblical history centered around them. We know exactly where Nineveh is, but it wasn't an issue of his tribe inhabiting that city and building a great tribe or a nation out of that. It's more the point that he built things. And so it tells us some of these great things that he built in verses 10 through 12. All right. Verse 13 and 14, we have another tribe here. This is an important one. We have two here, and the second one's really important. Mizraim became the father of Ludum and Anamim and Lahaban and Nephtuim. I told you some of these names get tough, and I'm probably saying them wrong. Pethruzim and Kazluim, from which came the Philistines. So they didn't keep his name, but it's his tribal group, and eventually they became known as the Philistines and Caphtorim. So let's find Mizraim first on your map. Duet. Above Egypt, right above the word Egypt is Mizraim. So they're close in proximity to Put. If you look at it geographically, they're very close in proximity to Put. If you go to the right and up towards Jordan, there you'll find the Philistines. And these are the descendants of Castulam. Castulam. I think I'm saying it right now. Castulam. So Castulam settled there just south of the Canaanites, and those people became the Philistines. Now, if you look at that stack, Philistines, Canaanites, and Amorites, which we'll get to later, you see those were the groups that are still there, even after the 400 years of captivity in Egypt, and they move into the Promised Land. They're constantly having to face the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the Amorites, because those were the people that were already settled and had been there for hundreds of years when Abraham's descendants arise. Modern-day Jordan is still inhabited by the Philistines, the Canaanites, and the Amorites. And they will tell you that too. They will tell you that they were displaced because they owned that entire region prior to God giving the land of promise to the Hebrew people. Verse 15 through 17, Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite. So the Amorites, just above the Canaanites, come up in the next. And the Amorite name, where they came from, is descendants of Canaan, of his children. And the Girgashite and the Hivite and the Archite and the Sinite. So some of these other ites, such as the Girgashite, the Hivites, the Archite, and the Sinite, these were smaller tribes that don't really show up on the map, but they also had issues with these different groups, some of these different groups, when they entered into the Promised Land, because they all settled in that same general area. So if you look at verses 15 through 17, these would be the people that inhabit that whole area around, say, from Aram on down to where the Philistines are listed. So they were very nomadic as a general rule. The Philistines were more city dwellers. So were the Canaanites. The rest of these were more nomadic tribes. They were generally herdsmen, and they were much smaller in population. So that's why they're not listed on the map. Verse 18, and the Arvadite and the Zemarite and the Hamathite, and afterward the families of the Canaanite were spread abroad. So the Canaanites became very influential in this area. That's why you'll hear me talk about it, and you'll see it referenced in a lot of literature, where it talks about the tribes of Canaan, or the Canaanites, as a larger group. So you have the established group that dwelt in a specific regional area, and then you have the more nomadic offshoots that are mentioned from 15 or 16 to 18, and they were nomadic. They moved around a lot, basically. And so when Israel arrives with all those people, probably 2 million people when they actually arrived in the Promised Land, it caused quite a stir, because 2 million people is going to take up a lot of pasture land for nomadic people, and you see the obvious conflicts that are then going to happen. 2 million people not only need a lot of pasture land, they need a lot of farmland, and guess what you need when you have both? Tons of water. Guess what the region doesn't have? Tons of clean water. So suddenly these nomadic people found themselves displaced from their typical areas to travel to for their herds. And so eventually you start having raids and conflicts, and it just went on and on and on. But again, you see that stage set when you understand where all these people were in the world and where they came from. Verses 19 through 21. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go towards Gerar as far as Gaza. And if you want to look this up, there's some great online maps. I didn't have a chance to write down the URLs, but you can find them by doing Google searches, and you can find some of these ancient maps that tell you what the extent was. At one point, the Canaanites owned a pretty substantial portion of land, especially if you factor in all the nomadic tribal offshoots of the Canaanites. So they extended from Sidon as you go towards Gerar as far as Gaza, as you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zebulun, as far as Lasha. Of course, we've heard of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That's where Lot ends up living. As far as Lasha, these are the sons of Ham according to their families. Then we transition into Ham. Actually, we already are into Ham. I apologize. So Ham according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. So it's kind of a summary. But again, it's reminding us according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. So this substitutes lands in for families. And so we get another point of contention. As they settled, they established the geographical boundaries of their lands, and the land belonged to them. And then if others wanted it, they had to take it. The Philistines are an interesting group. It doesn't appear anywhere in biblical history or extra-biblical history that they ever put a lot of effort into farming or raising herds. If you don't put a lot of effort into farming, at least historically, we can't find any. They did some, I'm sure. But if you don't put a lot of effort into farming and raising herds, how do you survive in that period of time? You steal others' stuff. So what did he think the Philistines were doing before Israel arrived in the land of promise? Stealing stuff. They would raid the Canaanites, and so we have some extra biblical sources that talk about the Philistines, even before Israel arrives, raiding Canaanite villages or Canaanite settlements on the fringes, or some of the nomadic tribes just rushing in and taking their herds and then using them for food for themselves. And then when Israel arrives, they just continued their same method of living, and that, of course, created a lot of hardship between Israel and the Philistines, and that continued all the way through till David. David's finally the one who subdued the Philistines, finally, and he had to do it through force. But again, we see the general pattern already kind of laid out for us here. So verse 22 through 24, the sons of Shem were Elam and Asher and Arpachshad and Lud and Aram. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. That's a lot in one verse, and we only have one more after this that we have to find. So let's find Elam first. Again, these are the sons of Shem. So if you're looking at your chart on Noah's family, the left hand is Shem, and these are his sons. And a lot of these, in fact, all of his sons became nations. Elam, where is it? On the right, towards the bottom, is Elam, right? At the very bottom of modern-day Iran. And that became known as what? What's that little word in fine print under it? Persia. So we have it's easy to see the combination of the Medes and the Persians, because just above that's Madai. They became the Medes. In Elam, they became the Persians. They united to oust the Babylonians, and that was where the Medes and the Persians came from. The next one is Asher. Where's Asher at? Straight up from Iraq. And guess who Asher became? So this is in probably more in Iran, but also partially in Iraq. They kind of bridged the two modern-day nations. They became the Assyrians that we were talking about earlier. I told you we would identify where the Assyrian Empire grew from. By the time the Assyrian Empire reaches its full bloom, they pretty much controlled everything on this map. That's how powerful they became. The Assyrian Empire pretty much controlled everything on this map at some point. So that's how powerful of a tribe Asher became. Arpachshad, which is going to be spelled with an X, is down in the bottom right, just to the left of Elam. So if you go back down to Elam on the far right bottom and look to the left, there's Arpachshad, which is even a little farther down into Iran, right on the coast. This was a coastal tribe, mostly survived on fishing. And then we have Lud. Lud is the exact opposite. Go all the way to the top left. Just above the Greeks, Javan, is Lud, which became also known as Lydia. The reason you see these smaller designations is they will be identified in this way in other parts of the Old Testament. So when you see Lydia, it's talking about Lud. You still kept the same original tribal affiliation, but the name or the way in which they were known changed over time. Just like today. If you're talking about Iranians, you're talking about people who descended from Madai, Elam, Arphaxad, probably a little bit of Asher and Ashkenaz mixed in. Aram is the last one until we move to the very bottom. Where's Aram at? Where is it? Syria. Aram is right below the word Syria. It's not just in Syria, it's right below the word Syria. There you go. It's easy to find. So there's Aram. And Aram is known as the primary people group in Syria today. So modern-day Syria is known or identified directly with Aram. I mean, again, some of these are going to intermingle, especially on the borderlines, but the main people in Syria today are descendants of Aram. Now, this one's not identified on your map, but the sons of Aram were, what were Aaron's sons' name? What's the first one? Uz. Uz and Hul. Now, Uz doesn't become a tribe, but he does have his name identified with a city, which then was referenced to as a land. And Abraham himself would be a descendant of Aram, the son of, because he was the father of Uz, and Uz created a city. So the best that we can tell, and I think it's pretty solid from this table of nations and geographical locations that we have, that Abraham was born somewhere in Syria, wherever the city of Uz was. And there's several different opinions about where Uz was, but it was in Syria. Everybody agrees on that because it was built by one of the sons of Aram, and Aram settled in Syria, modern-day Syria. And so Abraham was born in the city of Uz. We got one more we'll work our way down to in just a second. Let's move on to the next few verses, 25. It's actually going to be in verse 25. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And Joktan is where on the map? Saudi Arabia. And his tribe became known as Arabia, Arabians. Arabian people are descendants of Joktan. So people that we would identify as Arab, and you've heard that term. We use it way too broadly, by the way, because Syrians would not consider themselves Arabs. People from Saudi Arabia would consider themselves Arabs. People from Qatar Some of those other countries in that region would consider themselves Arabs, but if you go further up, like to Turkey, they do not consider themselves Arabs, although we mistakenly often apply that tribal designation to them. And this is why they don't consider themselves that, because that's not where they come from, and they know that. So these people in this part of the world, they kind of know where they come from. They know that these tribal affiliations that are listed here go all the way back then. There's something very interesting in this verse that's often overlooked. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days, during his lifetime, the earth was divided. Did you ever catch that? This is post-flood, right? Post-flood. What does it mean, several generations after the flood, that the earth was divided? You ever wonder why, if you take a globe or take a flat map, especially if you take a flat map, and you look at all the coastlines, that if you took the middle of that out, you could just put those together like a jigsaw puzzle? Does anybody really think that's an accident? He tells you exactly when it happened. At some point, and during this guy's lifetime, that's when God split it. It's in there, isn't it? I think stuff like that's fascinating. I really do. Call me weird, but that's what it says. In his day, the earth, and if you look it up in the Hebrew, it's talking about the land. The earth was divided. The land was divided. And if you look at the map, it sure looks like the land was divided, doesn't it? Okay. That's neither here nor there. You don't have to believe that's what that means. I tend to side with that one, though it makes a lot of sense to me. I just find it one of those interesting things that God just tucks into a passage of genealogies. He just happens to tuck in a piece of data that would have been very important to those people. They would have been familiar with that event. I'm sure everybody was familiar with that event, right? But Joktan became the father of Almadad and Shelah, and I'm not going to read all those names unless you want to make me. Do you want to make me, really? I think my voice is going out again. It's really getting hurt. This horse in my throat's starting to hurt. Don't you feel sorry for me? Thank you. And I'm done. That's kind of cool, though, isn't it? So now you have all this historical information that's completely accurate. It's amazingly accurate how close the Bible's not just close, it's spot on. And now you have the map. So don't lose this, especially don't lose this. Because as we dive into these chronologies of the Old Testament, everything that we're going to see when we're looking at these kings, the secular kings and the Hebrew kings, you're going to be able to find on here. You're going to be able to find these nations. You're going to be able to find these people groups. Yes? Mizraim? I can tell you real quick. Hold on just a second. If I can go back here. There we go. I messed myself up. There we go. It's right at the top, I think. Hold on. There it is. Verse 13. Did I get going too fast again? Sometimes I get a little excitable. I like stuff like this. I know not everybody likes stuff like this, but to me it's kind of fascinating because, and it does help. It helps you understand the people and the places and why things happen the way they did. So verse 13 does not have Mizraim in it. Hold on. I'm sure mine does. I copied it out there. Mine does. I copied mine right out of the NASB. Mizraim's the first word in verse 13. Well, I don't know what's wrong with your Bible. I may have to look at it for you. Because my Bible right here it's Mizraim. We'll take a look at that later on. Oh, that's your problem. You got an ESV. Okay, I understand. No, it should be in there. I don't know why it's not. I'll look up and find out why it's not in there. Because in all my survey stuff, it's Mizraim. So I will look it up, though. I'm glad you pointed out. If anybody else sees something like that in your Bible, let me know. I'm not afraid to look it up. But in mine, in the King James, I know it's in Mizraim as well as also the ancient manuscripts. I don't know where that would come from. I would have to look it up to even see why that was a problem. But again, as we close, keep this map. You're going to see, as we work our way through, you're going to see where Abraham journeys from. He'll be journeying from somewhere in middle Syria. You'll see where he goes. They go down into Egypt. You'll see the captivity then. Oh, and by the way, your homework. You guys did great. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and told me the answer. If you didn't get it, we're going to let you know what it is. By the way, how many of you got it? Be honest and raise your hand. Woohoo! I'm proud of you guys. You did great. Isn't that cool? Because what's at the very end of that verse? What did God prophesy or God tell Abraham was going to happen? 400 years. How long did they stay in Egypt? 400 years. So he tells Abraham, you're going to be a great nation. There's going to be a little pause, though, in the development of that nation. You're going to go somewhere, and you're going to have to stay there as captives for 400 years, and I'm going to set you free and put you in the land of promise. They knew, if they were listening, they knew that they were going to spend 400 years in captivity, and at the end of that 400 years, God was going to set them free and take them into the land of promise. Here's what's sad. 400 years later, God sets them free, and guess what they don't do? Believe. How could you not believe that God was going to put you in the promised land when he told your founder, the founder of your nation, a man named Abraham, that you were going to spend 400 years in slavery? At the end of 400 years, God's going to set you free and put you in the land of promise. Why would you? Does that not seem crazy to you? What's the odds that Abraham would know you're going to spend 400 years in slavery, God's going to set you free, he's going to put you in the land of promise? They were fine with the 400 years, being set free, and then the land of promise? Oh, no, God's not giving it to us. We got this wrong. How do you develop that mindset? Why is it that we lack faith? I guess would be a question, wouldn't it? When Jesus died for our sins, saved us, changed us, put his Spirit in us, and yet I lack faith, you lack faith. Why? Just as crazy, isn't it? We get complacent, we kind of get used to being blessed, and yeah, there's a lot of factors there. Yes. Yes. So chronology. So you have to take these historical narratives very carefully, though, because we're not always going to be in chronological order, and you have to kind of see that, because he's writing it way after all the events happen. So Moses is writing the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis included, and he's looking at it as the Spirit of God guides him way back in the rearview mirror. So all these things happened afterwards. So what he does is he takes the flood. He inserts this table of nations after the flood narrative because he's tracking Noah's 3 sons. This is prior to Babel. He tracks it all the way through 2 or 3 generations in this. I think it's 2 more generations after the sons. And then he tells us where all the people are coming from. And then he begins to tell us their stories afterwards. Does that make sense? So we get their stories afterwards. And it does that a lot in the Old Testament. You'll get genealogies, and then you get the stories of the characters after you get introduced to the characters. And that's the reason for the kind of twist up. Yep, and it's all very important. It all fits together then once you start to understand the way it's structured and you begin to be able to put the pieces together. That's why the survey is kind of cool to do, because you start to understand the various ways in which it's actually written versus the way we often perceive it. It's not like reading a novel. It's a little bit different. So, all right, anything else? All right, let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for another day. Thank you for the word you've blessed us with. Thank you for the opportunity to study and learn and grow. I pray you would help us all as we try to work our way through and kind of survey the Old Testament and learn about all the peoples and places. Help us to identify them correctly. Help us to see kind of the interactions of the people and learn from that. There's so many things we're going to learn from the conflicts, the tribal disputes, the issues that come up that really resonate with us in our lives today. And so I just pray that you would help us to learn, help us to just draw nearer to you, and above all, help us this coming week as we all go forth to live for you and strive to be faithful to you in all things, and give us the strength we need and the direction we need. And we pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.